All right, so we're in section 9.6, quadratic formula. You should have paper, pencil out, writing something down. And I will give you a heads up here that at some point in the next week or so, we will have a pop quiz on the quadratic formula memorization. You need to memorize the quadratic formula.
And it's just the formula.
Just the formula. Quadratic formula is extremely important. Once you learn it in math, it will never go away. All right, for ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. And I want to emphasize here, when we're solving quadratic equations with the quadratic formula, it must equal 0. That's always where we start when we're using the quadratic formula. The quadratic formula is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all divided by 2a. So if we know a, b, and c, we can plug them into this formula and figure out the solutions to this quadratic equation. And we have the plus or minus, just like when we solved by using square roots, or we solved by completing the square. When we take the square root, we get a plus or a minus. We get two solutions. This works for any quadratic equation. As long as we start with our quadratic equation equaling 0. And the quadratic formula is not some secret magical thing. This comes from completing the square on ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. We go through the process of completing the square on this equation, and this becomes our solution to our equation. So this actually comes from completing the square. So what we're going to do today is I just want to show you how we go about using this equation. Any questions on the equation? So at sometime in the next week or so, we'll have a pop quiz on this equation. So you need to memorize it somehow. If a song type thing helps you memorize the quadratic equation, if you search on YouTube, you'll find quadratic equation song. You'll find probably lots of quadratic equation songs that might help you memorize this. That kind of thing doesn't work for me, so I don't want to lock you into memorizing it in a particular way or using a particular song, but for some people it works. So if you Google it, quadratic equation song, if that helps you memorize it, just sing a song that goes along with it, that's fine. I just memorized it.
Or you can create one on your own.
You can create one on your own, yeah. All right, so let's look at a couple of examples. So we want to solve x squared minus 3x minus 10 using the quadratic formula. Now, before I start, could we solve this one by factoring? Are there two numbers that multiply to negative 10 and add to positive 3? 2 and 5. So we could factor this one, right? Factoring would probably be easier. If we can factor, usually it's probably easier. But we're using the quadratic formula because the problem tells us to use the quadratic formula. And the quadratic formula always works. Here we have A is 1, B is negative 3, and C is negative 10. Now when I plug these numbers into my quadratic formula, I'm going to use parentheses so that we get the pluses and minuses correct. The quadratic formula tells us x equals negative 3, and I'm putting that in parentheses, plus or minus the square root of negative 3 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 10, all divided by, and be very careful here, everything is divided by 2 times 1. Now what I'm going to do is calculate the stuff on the top first and divide by 2 at the very end. So I get x equals negative 3 is positive 3, plus or minus a square root, negative 3 squared. When we square a negative number, we get a positive. Negative 4 times 1 is negative 4, times negative 10 is positive 40, so plus 40, all divided by 2. So this equals 3 plus or minus the square root of 49 divided by 2. The square root of 49 is 7. If you're not sure, you can plug that in your calculator. So we get 3 plus or minus 7 over 2. So x equals 3 plus 7 is 10 divided by 2, or x equals 3 minus 7 is negative 4 divided by 2. So x equals 5, or x equals negative 2. And those are the answers we would have gotten if we factored. We saw that our 2 and 5 are what we would have picked for our factors. So factoring probably would have been faster, a little less work to do to calculate, but the quadratic formula always works. Yes? Oh, yes, this should be 0. Thank you. All right, questions there? And if you go through this process step by step the way I did here, you don't make arithmetic errors. A lot of times students make errors because they try to combine stuff together too much, and then their answers end up kind of wonky. All right, let's look at another one. 5x squared plus 12x minus 2 equals 0. And we want to solve this. So we could try to factor this. I would say A is 5, B is 12, and C is negative 2. And if we tried to factor, we would do something like this. A times C is negative 10. And here we put positive 12. And in order to get a negative, when we multiply, I have to have a plus and a minus. And we'd say, okay, I need two numbers that multiply to negative 10 and add to positive 12. Can we find those two numbers? No. There's no two numbers that multiply to negative 10 and add to positive 12. So we can't factor. That would be a clue that we would use the quadratic formula. If we try to factor and we can't, that's when we use the quadratic formula. So I'm going to plug my numbers in. X equals negative 12 plus or minus the square root of 12 squared minus 4 times 5 times negative 2 all over 2 times 5. So that's going to equal negative 12 plus or minus the square root. 12 squared is 144. Negative 4 times 5 is negative 20. Times negative 2 is positive 40. All over 10. So x equals negative 12 plus or minus the square root of 184 divided by 10. 184, square root of 184, we need our calculator for that. So let me grab that. Here is our calculator. And I'll just remind us how we find a square root in our calculator. We need a reminder. So I'm going to, my square root is usually this shifted button, the second button on x squared. So I'm going to do second square root, and my number is 184. 184. And that's about 13.56. So this is x equals negative 12 plus or minus 13.56 divided by 10. So x equals negative 12 plus 13.56 divided by 10, or x equals negative 12 minus 13.56 divided by 10. And when I plug this in my calculator, negative 12 plus 13.56 divided by 10, I get 0.16. Or negative 12 minus 13.56 divided by 10, I get negative 2.56. And usually when you can't factor a quadratic, your answers for your x's are going to be decimals. Not being able to factor usually means your answers turn out to be decimals.
And decimals are okay.
Decimals are okay.
Still part of an answer.
All right, questions there? Okay. We can also use a quadratic formula to decide how many solutions a quadratic equation has. And let's think back, because we talked about this when we were graphing, where the solutions are where our graph crosses the x-axis. Usually, how many solutions do we get for a quadratic equation? We usually get 2, because our parabola is a U-shape. It crosses the x-axis in 2 places. Is it possible to get 1 solution? Yes, that's when the vertex just touches the x-axis. So our graph touches the x-axis in 1 place. Is it possible to get no solutions? Yeah, we could have a graph that looked like this. And our vertex is up above the x-axis or down below the x-axis. We get no solution. And do we remember when we solved by taking square roots? What told us when we solved by taking square roots that we had no solution? When we were taking a square root of a negative. And that comes up again with the quadratic formula, because we're taking a square root here. We end up trying to take the square root of a negative. That tells us there's no solution. So we can use this part of the quadratic formula to tell us how many solutions we're going to get. And that part of the quadratic formula is called the discriminant. The discriminant is the b squared minus 4ac part of the quadratic formula. And this will tell us how many solutions we have. If b squared minus 4ac is positive, if it's greater than 0, we have 2 solutions. We get one solution for the plus part of the square root and one solution for the minus part of the square root. And that tells us our graph looks something like this, where it's crossing in 2 places, or, thank you, or our graph looks something like this, opening down and crossing in 2 places. If b squared minus 4ac equals 0, we have one solution. And that tells us our graph just touches the x-axis at the vertex, like that, or maybe like this. And like we just talked about a second ago, if b squared minus 4ac is less than 0, we have no solution. And that means our graph looks like that, or maybe like this. Doesn't touch the across the x-axis ever. So you'll get problems in your homework that say, how many solutions does this have? And we can use the discriminant to figure it out. Before we would have to do a little more work. We might have said, oh, it opens up, and the vertex. We'd have to find the vertex, figure out where the vertex is. If it opens up and the vertex is down here, then we know it has 2 solutions. We would do some work like that. With the discriminant, we just calculate this number, decide if it's greater than or less than 0. Figure out how many solutions we have. All right, so let's look at a couple of examples using the discriminant, and that's really all we're going to talk about for today. (2x squared plus 7x minus 15 equals 0. And we just want to know how many solutions. Well, A is 2, B is 7, C is negative 15. So we're going to use the discriminant. B squared minus 4ac is 7 squared minus 4 times 2 times negative 15, which is 49. 4 times 2, actually I'm going to do 2 times 15 is 30, times 4 is 15 times 4 is 60, plus 60. Well, is that bigger than 0? Yeah, we're adding 2 numbers together. It's greater than 0. It doesn't really matter what it is. All that matters is it bigger than 0? Does it equal 0 or less than 0? So this tells us we have 2 solutions. No, I think I did some arithmetic wrong, didn't I? 8 times 15 is 120. I was off by 2.
I have to multiply the 2 with it.
I forgot to
Or-
multiply the
or
2.
times the 2.
Yeah. It's still bigger than 0, though. Yes.
Why did you do like the square root and divide by 2?
All we're worried about for this one is how many solutions we have. And if what's under the square root is positive, then in our quadratic formula we have negative b plus or minus whatever that number is, so we get the 2 solutions. So all we really care about is counting the number of solutions. We're not worried about the other numbers. We just want to know if the square root, if what's under the square root is positive, we're guaranteed to get 2 solutions. All right, let's look at one more. How many solutions again? X squared minus 5x minus 10 equals 0. Sorry, plus 10 equals 0. A is 1. B is negative 5. C is 10. So b squared minus 4ac is negative 5 squared minus 4 times 1 times 10. Negative 5 squared is positive 25 minus 40. Is that bigger than 0 or less than 0? Less than 0. So we have no solutions, because we'd end up trying to take the square root of a negative number in our quadratic formula. So that gives us no solutions. All right. Questions on our quadratic formula? The quadratic formula, one of the methods of solution that we will need to use on our formative assessment problems that we're going to do over the next several days starting on block day. Okay. Homework, this is section 9.6. We're on page 586. Number 8 through 44 even.